Good morning, friends, chess players, and welcome back. Today, once again, we have an appointment to improve our middle game skills, and we're going to look at one of the most important techniques in chess, which is the technique of defense. So, how to defend a position. I'll give you the usual 5 rules to help guide your thinking, so let's get started right away. Before we begin, as always, I remind you that if you want to support the channel, subscribe and leave a like. By now you know the drill, so let's go straight to the chessboard and start looking at this game that will illustrate the techniques for us. For now I won't spoil anything, let's take a look at this opening. So d4, d5 and e3. So here, white is trying to set up a stone wall, which may not be particularly correct from a computer's point of view, but it's definitely a very practical weapon. Both players here, in any case, are strong players. They're both masters with ratings above 2,200 points. Their Elo ratings are probably unknown, so they're not famous, but they're definitely of a good level. And so here we have this stone wall where black, for now, is just playing in a rather traditional way, developing the pieces with the knight. Knight to f6, bishop to e7, attacks the center with c5, nothing to say so far, knight to f3, short castling, knight to bd2. At this point, we begin to introduce our first rule to follow when defending a chess position, because soon this position will become one that needs to be defended. So, the first rule for defending, which may seem obvious but it isn't, is to identify the threat. What does it mean to identify the threat? It means trying to imagine which of my opponent's pieces are the most dangerous and how my opponent will conduct the attack. So the first rule is a rule of recognition. In this case, this is a well-known structure, it's a stone wall. Usually white will want to play with the knight going to e5, and then after castling he will bring this rook along this path. And so, let's say, he will apply strong pressure on the h7 square. Furthermore, white also has ideas to remove our defender, simply by playing the move g4 followed by pawn to g5, which attacks our knight. So, let's say we can already immediately identify that the piece that will probably bother us the most is the bishop on d3. Having identified this, which is a very important first step, we can move on to the second rule, which is already a bit more technical. The second rule is simplification. Try to exchange the attacking pieces. The defender has a single task: to try to relieve the position. Why is this? Because if I exchange some pieces with my opponent, their offensive potential will obviously decrease. Obviously, I need to try to exchange the right pieces, so it's pointless, for example, in this position to exchange this bishop on c1, which is very bad. First, I need to identify the threats in order to understand that the piece to exchange might be that bishop on d3. And here black, excellently, look at what he plays. He plays the move b6. Why does he play this move? Because he wants to use his bishop on c8, which was basically doing nothing. As we said, the bishop will be exchanged through the move bishop to a6. So we are going to exchange our bishop for the opponent's. And once white no longer has this bishop, their offensive potential will definitely decrease, and by quite a bit. Let's move on. Knight to e5. At this point, I can't play right away. Bishop to a6, because here after the exchanges that move might bother me. Knight to c6. No, because it would take away my good bishop. Nothing particularly serious, but still, here black wisely decides before playing bishop to a6 to bring the queen to c7, so that all threats are defended. At this point, white castles short and black plays bishop to a6. Let's pay attention. White could have avoided this exchange, for example, by moving the bishop. In this way, white preserves his bishop. However, this move is not exactly optimal, because I can still play bishop to a6. And look at this bishop. See how it gains a tremendous amount of influence. So, it's true that white hasn't allowed black to exchange the piece, but let's say white has allowed something else that is definitely very convenient for black. That's why, let's say, it's not so easy to avoid this exchange with bishop to a6. At this point, white exchanges in an attempt to push the black knight a bit out of play. That makes sense and continues with his plan. Rook to f3, rook to h3, just as we mentioned earlier. Obviously, from this point of view, the absence of the important bishop on d3 makes this plan for white much less effective. Just imagine if there were a bishop on d3 here, there would be immediate pressure and some significant problems to deal with. At this point then, black is not afraid of an immediate attack, so he played the move b5, which, let's say, pushes a little bit. He also starts his own counterplay on the queen side, so in a sense he has struck a blow by reducing the opponent's dynamism by exchanging that piece on d3. And now he strikes back as well, trying to do something proactive. White plays a 3, and black decides that the correct move is knight b8, a very logical move since the knight on a6. is very, very passive, so knight to b8 in any case. Let's try to reposition it to much better squares. For this knight, in fact, rook to h3, knight to c6, knight df3. And here black makes a decision that, in this case, is fine. But I need to explain it to you because black decides to play knight takes e5. So he simplifies by exchanging another piece. This is great for us because by simplifying pieces, our opponent will obviously have less offensive potential. However, be careful with the stonewall structure regarding this kind of exchange because usually, especially when white has the bishop on d3 putting pressure on h7, white can capture with the pawn, f. And at this point, he carries out a removal of the defender. You see, in this case, by removing the knight, if he had the bishop on d3, I would be immediately defeated because in any case, let's say something would immediately come that takes on h7 and so I would have lost. In this case, let's say there is no bishop on d3, so black makes this exchange because maybe he also takes advantage of the absence of the bishop on d3 to play the move knight to e4. So by placing this knight in a really interesting position, so for this reason, this exchange here is fine, but don't do it with your eyes closed. Here white plays knight takes e5. And finally, we can get to our third rule because white's attack isn't over yet. Here, white will slowly try to make a move. g4, then g5 will drive away our knight, and at that point the queen comes in and attacks the weak spot on h7. So you see that all of white's attack revolves around the h7 square. And at this point, let's move on to the third rule, the third defensive technique, which is opening up the 7th rank. What is opening up the 7th rank? Is simply about trying to push these pawns. So here it starts with the move g6, and in the future it will try to push this pawn as well, so as to open up the 7th rank. What is the purpose of all this? When I open up the 7th rank, my pieces, in particular of course the rooks and the queen, come into play much more easily and can defend the 7th rank. Be careful guys, don't use this technique blindly. Why is this technique good? Because white's target is the h7 square, which is the hardest point to defend. So in this case, I'm creating weaknesses for myself because the move g6 and the future move f6 will be weaknesses. But these weaknesses, however, are compensated by the fact that I gain defensive activity on the 7th rank, and in any case, once again, having exchanged two minor pieces, white doesn't have much dynamism left. In particular, there's this piece that isn't even attacking because it's blocked. And so I can afford to create these weaknesses because I want to achieve the goal of defending the h7 square, which is the only weak point. But be careful, if white has all their pieces active, watch out for making too many weaknesses. So this too should be used sparingly. Bishop to d2. At this point, obviously black brings the knight to f4, which is a very strong square, and of course this also opens up the possibility of playing f6 later. White tries to reposition their pieces as much as this bishop, which was rather useless, can do, and so black first plays like this: c takes d4, e takes d4, and now a5. Let's say there's no immediate rush to play f6, okay? He can play it whenever he wants. He could have played it here as well, but he decided to go with a5 first. g4, f6. Now he plays it knight to d3, bishop to d6. You see how the queen and the rooks now defend the entire 7th rank, and there are practically no more risks. White goes all in, playing f5, but I take g5. And at this point, the king side might seem weak. But in reality, that's not the case, because from the 7th rank, thanks to the opening of the 7th, I go on to control everything I need from there. Thank you. Everything I need. At this point, white, a bit desperate, exchanges this piece as well. And we arrive at the 4th technique. Active defense. If possible, create stronger threats, but be careful with active defense. As I mentioned in the other video, you can play active defense if and only if your dynamism is sufficient, so your pieces must be active. In this case, in the end, our bishop and our queen are quite active, while his pieces are rather passive, so we can say that I have enough dynamism, and therefore I can afford to play actively. Look at what white does. Now black brings his pieces into play. He tries to create some threats just in case, and at this point brings his pieces into play. Look at how black now has tremendous activity. Rook to f3, and now black completes the defense with the second rule, which is simplification. So queen, f7 exchanges the last piece that needs to be exchanged and basically enters this position, where he obviously has a huge advantage. Because let's say he has total control of the file, and the only open file he can keep expanding on the king side with h5 and h4. This pawn is very weak, and moreover, he can also launch a minority attack with b4, weakening black's queen side. In short, a rather pleasant position. Unfortunately, don't do this. Black had a few points less than white, and probably here a draw was offered and black accepted, ruining our chance to see this endgame here, which as we said is a big advantage. Black, so don't do it. Just because your opponent is stronger, it doesn't mean you have to give away a draw. And so let's say we still haven't seen the fifth technique. I'll show it to you here. Last but not least, the fifth technique. But we already know it. It's prophylaxis. That is, prevention is better than cure. So if I, even before my opponent sets up the attack, manage to do something to block it, if you will, the first two rules. So try to exchange the attacking pieces. What we did exactly in this position when we played b6 is a kind of prophylaxis, because in any case, we remove the attacking piece, and so we are carrying out prophylaxis in this regard. So in any case, the fifth rule, prophylaxis, we have to include it because it is necessary. A little bonus, the sixth rule, but actually I include it in the in the fourth rule, of course, active defense, opening the center. It is often said that to defend against a flank attack, we need to counterattack in the center, because by opening the center, our pieces become more active and in some way are able to defend the attack. This is absolutely true and correct. However, an important point, let's place this technique under rule 4, under active defense. Because active defense, it presupposes that we can use it when we have sufficient dynamism, and the same goes for opening the center. Because if we lack dynamism, that is, if all our pieces are passive, opening the lines won't be a great idea. So opening the center is fine. But let's treat it as if it were a defensive move. So I open the center if I can afford it in terms of piece activity, but if all my pieces are passive, it's better not to open it. The lines, okay. So it's important to put everything in its proper place. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for being with me today and for following this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this format about the rules of attack and defense, and I look forward to seeing you in the next videos.